Hello and welcome to this TLDR video, where we explain the euro. This video is going to be split broadly into three sections. The first will explain what the euro is and how countries might adopt it. The second will deal with the history of the euro, when and why it was adopted. And the third will take a look at whether or not it was a good idea. Before we dive in, this week is your last chance to sign up for our Patreon and claim your free golden EU pin badge. This badge will never be available for public release, and is exclusive to our $10 and up patrons. That's about £9 for an exclusive badge, and we normally charge about £6 for our other badges anyway. In fact, this topic was even chosen by our Patreon backers in a recent poll. So to get the deal and all of the other perks of membership, including voting on video topics, check out our Patreon. It's linked down below. The euro is the official currency of the EU, or well, at least most of it. It's used by 19 of the 27 member states. That's Austria, Belgium, Cyprus, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, the Netherlands, Portugal, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Spain. As well as these EU nations, there are also 6 non-EU member states using the euro. These are Monaco, San Marino, the Vatican City, Andorra, Kosovo, and Montenegro. The first 4 have a monetary agreement with the EU, allowing them to use the euro, but Kosovo and Montenegro adopted it unilaterally, which is just a fancy way of saying they made it their official currency without the EU's permission. The 19 EU countries that use the euro are known as the EUROZONE. The 8 EU countries outside of the EUROZONE are Denmark, Sweden, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Croatia, and Romania. Denmark, along with the UK, opted out of joining the euro at the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. Sweden had a referendum on the euro in 2003, where Swedes voted to keep their national Swedish krona. According to EU rules, the Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland, as members of the EU without any opt-outs, should in theory be working towards joining the euro, but they've made it clear they don't want to, so it's realistically not going to happen. The last 3 on that list, Bulgaria, Croatia and Romania, are currently in the process of joining, and Bulgaria is expected to join in 2022, Croatia in 2023, and Romania in 2024. So how do you go about joining the euro? Well, there are essentially 3 stages of becoming and staying a Eurozone member. First things first is joining the EU. To do this, you have to meet the Copenhagen criteria. These criteria were first thought up at the European Council conference in June 1993, which, as you guessed it, was in Copenhagen. There are essentially 4 economic criteria, and these are: the government's deficit must not exceed 3% of GDP, gross government debt must not exceed 60% of GDP, the member state must have achieved exchange rate stability for at least 2 years, according to the rules of the European Exchange Rate Mechanism. Currently, the European Exchange Rate Mechanism allows for a plus or minus 15% fluctuation from the pre-agreed central rate. The nominal long-term interest rates of applicant nations must not have exceeded by more than 2% the average interest rates in the 3 member states with the best records on price stability, where price stability is defined as year-on-year inflation increases of less than or near 2%, according to the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, or HICP. After you've done all that, you can now apply to join the Eurozone. To do this, you need to meet the Maastricht criteria, otherwise known as the convergence criteria. Again, there are 4 criteria for this. Inflation, measured against the HICP, can't exceed 1.5% above the average of the 3 EU member states with the lowest HICP inflation rates. The country must not be under excessive deficit procedure at the time of examination. They must be not more than 2% above the rate of the best 3 performing member states in terms of price stability. And they must have participated in the European Exchange Rate Mechanism for at least 2 years without severe tensions, in particular without devaluing against the euro. And once you've done that and you've joined the Eurozone, you have to abide by some rules if you want to stay in it. Although you'd have to do something seriously wrong to actually be kicked out, because kicking a country out of the Eurozone is a pretty harsh thing to do. That's because once you've been in the Eurozone for a while, most of your debt will be denominated in euros, which means having to switch it back to your national currency, presuming it's not as strong as the euro, will make it almost impossible for you to pay back your debt. Instead, countries who don't follow the rules are first subject to economic sanctions, with a maximum fine of 0.5% of GDP. In real terms, this means that if Italy decided to ignore the rules for long enough, it could be fined just under 10 billion euros. Anyway, these rules are laid out in the Stability and Growth Pact, or SGP, which was written up in 1997. It's worth noting that the SGP applies to all countries in the EU, not just the Eurozone ones, but it was proposed by the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl in response to concerns about the single currency. The SGP basically says that countries have to keep their deficit at 3% of GDP and debt at 60% of GDP. If the deficit goes above 3% or the debt goes above 60%, then countries have to implement a plan to decrease it, a plan approved by the EU. So that's how you join the euro, and how you stay in it. Now for its history. The idea of a single currency was first floated in 1970 by the French Prime Minister Pierre Werner in the Werner Report. The idea was to create an area where services, people, and capital could circulate freely without competitive distortions or regional disequilibrium. Although the Werner Report was abandoned, in 1979 the European Monetary System, or EMS, was launched. This created two things: the European Currency Unit, or ECU, and the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, ERM. The ECU was sort of a precursor to the euro, acting as the EU's unit of account. So EU budgets and spending were denominated in ECUs. ERM currencies had their exchange rates fixed to the ECU within adjustable bands. The French franc and German mark were fixed with a 2.5% band, whereas the Italian lira was fixed with a 6% band. It wasn't until late 1987 when the idea of a single currency was mentioned again, this time by the President of France, François Mitterrand, and the Prime Minister, Jacques Chirac. At the time, France was part of the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, which essentially tied the value of the French franc to the value of the West German Deutschmark, and the French weren't happy about the exchange rate mechanism. In 1983, when the French committed to their franc fort policy, they thought having the franc tied to the Deutschmark would mean German levels of inflation, growth, and borrowing. While it did mean lower levels of inflation, French growth still lagged behind German growth at the time, and their borrowing rates were higher. This led to constant currency speculation against the franc, with most traders thinking of the franc as overvalued against the Deutschmark. Again, the long and short of it was that the franc was tied to the Deutschmark but was worthless, and this was stressing the French out, so they floated the idea of the single currency. The real question is, why did the West Germans ever agree to it, given that they would essentially be devaluing their precious Deutschmark to help out the French? Well, Helmut Kohl, the West German Chancellor at the time, had two reasons. The first was that having a common currency would prevent competitive devaluations. The Deutschmark was getting so valuable that it was making German exports less competitive. All thought that other countries in Europe were deliberately devaluing their countries to allow their exports to undercut expensive German ones. The other reason was that Kroll thought that this would help bring about a political and institutional union in Europe, and he was right. In fact, when the Ministers of Finance in the European Economic Community agreed to hold an intergovernmental conference on the topic of a monetary union, it was so important that the actual leaders decided to hold a parallel conference on the future of the European political union. Out of these conferences, we get the Maastricht Treaty agreed in 1991 and stating that there'll be a single currency by 1999. And, hey presto, in 1999, we get the euro. However, the euro wasn't guaranteed in 1991. In 1994, there was a general election in Germany, which by now is just Germany, not West Germany. The Social Democrats, who came close to winning, weren't particularly keen on the euro, specifically on the idea of letting the Italians join. While the Christian Democrats won the election, they realised that the Social Democrats might have a point, so they essentially say that the Italians can only join if everyone signs up to the Stability and Growth Pact, and this happens in 1997. This was to maintain fiscal discipline across the Eurozone, without a formal fiscal union. The euro seemed doomed to fail in 1992, when there was the exchange rate mechanism crisis, which led to Black Wednesday in the UK. However, the global economy picked up in 1995, which made everyone feel a bit more optimistic about the project, especially because it had produced a conversion of interest rates and inflation across Europe. In fact, if it had not been for the conveniently well-timed uptick in the global economy, chances are the euro would have never have got off the ground. There's no way the European finance ministers would have gone along with such a radical idea as a single currency, unless it was all looking so rosy. Anyway, the euro entered circulation in paper form, as we still find it today. So that's the euro. And for the promised third section, was it a good idea? Well, none of us are economists at TLDR, and even economists don't seem to agree for sure. But what we do know is that everyone in the YouTube comments section is an economist. So for a definitive, flawless answer, just scroll down to the comments section below. But seriously though, it's interesting how opinions on the euro differ across Europe. Even in Greece, about 3/4 of people are in favour of it. In fact, it seems that if you have the euro, you like it, and if you don't, you think it's rubbish. And take from that what you will. If you want us to make a video on the pros and cons of the euro, then do let us know in the comments down below. So that's all we have to say on the euro for now. If you want more from us, be sure to subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video.